Welcome back. It's me, Aaron Berkowitz, with the JLJ, here with Michael Hickins, who is a novelist, memoirist, and journalist, and his influential short story collection, The Actual Adventures of Michael Missing, from Alfred A. Knopf, has been used as course material in MFA programs. Hickins was born in Queens, New York, and has plied his trade with the Wall Street Journal, EiC, Women's Wear Daily, and Oracle. He lives with his wife and son in the deep, dark woods of Westchester County, New York, and his newest book, The Silk Factory, will be out June 1st from Amsterdam Publishers. Thank you for joining me today, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I'll start this the same way I start with almost every interview. I won't say every, but why this book and why now?
This book, I think is really important now because we're seeing a change in generation, and the generation of people who lived through the Holocaust, by and large, is unfortunately leaving us, and with it, the memory of what really happened. I'm very fortunate because both my parents were pretty old when I was born, which, first of all, I'm lucky because that doesn't always happen, but also because it means that they were able to transmit a lot to me. But this book is different because it's about what they didn't transmit to me, but what they didn't knowingly transmit to me, or what I didn't know that they transmitted to me. It's all of those things, because there were things they kept from me for reasons that I'll never know, but that became part of me unwittingly on their end. And then there are things that I have learned over the last few years that I think are important for people to know, because it helps, I think, a lot of us explain the turmoil that we feel inside. I think that for a lot of us, it's a little mysterious why, for instance, we're as angry as we are, or we get as angry as we do, as easily as we do. And I think my book is somewhat an exploration of that.
Do you think that it's sort of, let's say, a luxury of the present that we can go searching for these stories? I've been thinking a lot about this as I go through a lot of this Holocaust sort of literature, and thinking within a larger historical context, almost, that nowadays we seem more interested in searching for history or recording history. And I know there is what you're mentioning about, the generation is leaving us, so there's an insistence on sort of the importance of finding stories now. But I'm curious as to sort of how you see the Holocaust in sort of the grander picture of studying history and having to sort of find our way through details.
Well, your question about whether it's a luxury for us now, in a sense it is. We live in a time of relative peace and prosperity for Jewish people. And I say relative, and obviously there are people who are suffering, and there's still a lot of anti-Semitism and violence against Jewish people. But we're living at a time when that's not as accepted as it was in other periods in time, right? And so we do have the luxury of it's less luxury than privilege, right? We're privileged to be living in this moment, and for those of us who live in the United States, in this country, where by and large, we're safe as Jews. The people of Pittsburgh and other places accepted, and so I think that we do live in a moment of privilege, but I don't think it's just about Judaism either. I think that hate is universal, and it affects people universally. And I think that those of us who are privileged to not be the immediate foils for hate have a responsibility, I think, also to look at the larger world and say, what happened to us was unique in its scope, in its purpose, in its methodology, but it's not entirely unique in the human experience. And we owe our empathy to others as well. But also, I think that we live at a time when I think the the immediacy of the Shoah has receded to an extent that it's fading in importance to a lot of people. And yet, I think that the effects of the Holocaust continue to reverberate in ways that, you know, I discuss in my book. And I think it's important to explore that.
Yeah, there's a metaphor that's sort of apt here, that's within the title, I think, almost the idea of silk itself, right? How it's processed and the strings that have to come together in order to sort of make things. And I know that your background, obviously, in short stories seems to sort of lend itself to this idea of partitioning parts of a larger narrative within perhaps individual strands, let's call it, for metaphorical. Do you see that within the work that you're doing, that you're trying to create that that structure around the narrative?
It is, I think, also part of the historical moment in that I think that we are. I mean, if you look at, and I didn't intentionally do this, but if you look at what people like to binge on Netflix, they like small chunks that are woven into a larger theory, into a larger narrative. And you know, as you point out with the Adventures of Michael Missing, it's also a series of connected short stories. So yes, I think that the idea of, and you picked up on the, you know, the metaphor also of the full title of the book being The Silk Factory, Finding Threads of My Family's True Holocaust Story. So there's that sort of idea of the interweaving of different, and there are different elements, right? There's the part about my relationship to my wife, but there's also my relationship to my son, my older son, my younger son. There are stories within the stories. You know, one of the things that I learned is, as I learned that I had other members of my family that I, you know, wasn't aware of, is, you know, I have a sister who lost her children in a custody battle, which is unusual. Typically, especially in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, women did not lose custody battles, except under really odd circumstances. And yet I then meet a niece that I didn't know existed who also lost her children in a custody battle. And having two women like that in my family who don't even know each other is remarkable enough, but what they have in common is the same sort of root and the dysfunction that occurs in a family when you have trauma is real. So I don't know how, I think I went I went astray from your question, but
I think it's interesting to think about sort of the after effects, because I think something that comes up in your book that I don't know, I don't like the word controversial per se, but let's call it controversial for argument's sake, around reparations from the Holocaust. And sort of, I think that stems back to this idea that we're talking about around what are the after effects and how are they appropriately ameliorated by the perpetrator of said, you know, horrors. Is it reparations? Is it something that we, you know, look for? Is it something that sort of alleviates their burden in an unfair way? So I was just curious to sort of see how you square, because there were reparations in the end after World War II that were given to Jews. So how do you sort of square that with this idea of the ensuing trauma that perhaps still permeates today?
you know, I'm so glad you asked that question, because in my mind, it's far less about the reparations than it is about the acknowledgement. And you know, I described my own feelings going to two different places in Germany, and I lived in Europe for a long time, and then I didn't set foot in Germany until I embarked on this journey. And so the first place I went to in Germany was Ansbach, which is the small town in Bavaria where my father was born and where the silk factory, to my surprise, still exists. And what I found there was a kind of almost willful denial that Jews had ever lived there, or that anything untoward had happened at all. There was almost no signs of anything. And because I had emailed the people who run the silk factory now and said, hey, I'm related to these people who used to own this factory, and I'd like to come visit. And they were very nice, and they asked me in, they invited me in. And the first thing they wanted to do was show me the Stolperstein, that are these little bronze plaques that were created by a German artist a couple of decades ago, and that have gained sort of prominence. And they're inscribed. Each one is inscribed with the name of someone who lived in front of. They're placed in front of that person's house typically, and it's a way of commemorating the fact that these people were there. And they are and so they wanted the first thing they wanted to do was show me, look, we have these Stolpersteins here, and you could just see from looking at them that they had been put in, a month ago. The cement was still a different color than it hadn't. You could see that it hadn't blended in yet, and it wasn't done particularly well, and the information was incomplete. And my initial reaction was, well, I guess that's nice. It wasn't very satisfying as a thing. All the more so because then the guy says, and this is, for your listeners, this is my father's factory that his maternal grandfather had built, and the director general of the factory today says, "What did your father do here again? Like, are you kidding me? I told you in my email." Fast forward to a couple of weeks later, when I go to Wiesbaden, where a couple of retired historians have been doing research on families that have, were deported and murdered, and who had been doing research on my family. And Wiesbaden was completely different. They took me to a vast memorial wall in the middle of town. There was a memorial, a separate memorial inside City Hall, which was very different, more personal. They took me to stockyards where there was a large mural commemorating this is where the Jews were put in cattle cars. I mean, all sad, but meaningful. And the Stolperstein that were in front of my members of my family who had lived in Wiesbaden. And those, you could tell, had been there for years, and were well done. And the feeling that I had was one of gratitude. And I felt like I began to heal. And that's the thing. It's like, I never saw reparations. My family, and because they never talked about it, I don't know. They may have had some small reparations. Certainly nothing that changed our lives. But it doesn't matter. What matters to me is that there were people who cared enough to acknowledge what happened and to say they're sorry. And that is a lot. And I think that, when we think about what's going on in the United States with regards to African Americans, again, it's like the people who were apologizing to me in Germany weren't alive then, just as I wasn't. And white people in the United States didn't own slaves. But I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement and that sort of asking forgiveness is, I think, what's necessary for there to be healing in our country.
It's interesting also around sort of acknowledgement being perhaps a more poignant thing when it's, when you think of the stones in the street. I remember there was a controversy as to if that's considered respectful, or if it's considered like what, when you put them on the floor, what do we classify that as respectful or not? But it's interesting to think that you saw it as respectful, or at least acknowledge. How would you see it, like, when you're there experiencing it? Does it feel, I guess you see it as respectful, or do you see it as sort of just at least the very basic level of acknowledgement, or would you prefer it be in some other way, like on a wall perhaps, or we have memorials obviously in the United States where that it goes up in stone, not on the floor. So I'm just curious to like sort of that particular aspect of it.
Well, I'll say this: if you are a Hollywood star and you get your footprints on the, you get a foot, yeah, it's I mean, it's a star on the pavement, right? And no one turns it down for that reason. It never occurred to me. I am aware of that strand of thinking, and I respect it, but I don't agree, because it never would occur. It doesn't occur. Well, it wouldn't have occurred to me otherwise that it was a sign of disrespect. And the pragmatist in me thinks, well, how many walls are you going to have? So like, you can't have a wall in front of every house where a Jew lived. So having that, I think that also, and again, I mean, I'm a big Yankees fan. I go to Yankee Stadium all the time. I know it's a different story, but again, there are commemorative things on the pavement that, about different events that happen. So yeah, I'm aware of that. I don't see it as disrespectful at all.
And do you think I mean, obviously this is at the sort of basic level, this is a journey tale, let's call it, and that you feel that there was a conclusion to the journey? Do you feel like once you saw all these things, you were satisfied at the end of your journey, let's call it? Or do you think that it was sort of a middle ground somewhere that's still open, something that's still progressing?
Well, I think it's a beginning, right? I certainly don't think I'm at the end of it. And one of the things that my book also discusses is sort of the silence, and not just silence about bad things, but there were some people who behaved heroically in France, and who saved thousands of refugees, and my father never talked about that either, and I think I came to understand a little bit about why, but it was shocking nonetheless to discover that there was this amazing episode in his life that he never talked to me about.
Yeah, I often think about trauma's legacy being one of silence. That's a theme that definitely comes up, and that silence compounds itself because it breeds loneliness, which is a trauma in and of itself. That oftentimes also it sort of hit me before we started this. I don't know, about 5 minutes before we started this, I was thinking a lot about the lasting effects and the idea of a factory being a physical thing that could be taken. Whereas, obviously the classic trope now in America, let's say, is Jews are lawyers and doctors, and people who use their minds. And, there's that in sort of the Old Testament, our forefathers were of the tents and not of the field. But I think that part of the trauma also might be around sort of things that can be taken are physical, whereas if we're using our minds for medicine or for law, that's something that we can hold on to if we have to run somewhere else. I'm curious as to sort of your thoughts around, seeing the factory that all of a sudden now doesn't belong to your family anymore, and they're almost sort of denying that it ever belonged to your family, even when you show up at its doors. Do you see that connection where Jews have perhaps now taken on more of a intellectual pursuit to sort of combat this idea of things being taken from us?
It's funny because that you mentioned that, because both my parents wanted me to be doctors, in large part because they felt like if something like that, like the Holocaust, were to happen here in the United States, I could always take that skill with me somewhere else. And I do think that there's a large part of the American Jewish mentality, for lack of a better word, that is sort of geared to what can we do to earn a living that we can transport if we have to, and those kind of skills are part of it. But we tend to lose sight of the fact. I mean, the United States is, I think, mostly Ashkenazi Jews, and I think that we too sort of see the East Coast, especially on the coast. I think you know, the stereotypes, but so many of Jews who came over were either artisans, or you know, they were laborers, and they wanted what all Americans wanted for their children, which was a better life, and that went through education, and education often led to all these other careers that are not as manual. But I remember my father was extremely frustrated with me because I'm not particularly good with my hands. He was very good with his hands. And he was also very good at math, which I wasn't, which is why I'm a writer. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that development. I think that it's more a product of the Jews who came to the United States and their career paths, and the career paths of their children, and the opportunity. I mean, I think that, you know, the Jews who were able to come to the United States at that moment in history, came to the United States at the most propitious moment historically for anybody to come to the United States, and there was just this unbelievable boom, so, you know, I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, and when we think of education here, I think also it's important. You know, you were mentioning obviously the book is about a relationship with your wife, with your family, and so how do you think? Do you see this book as sort of an instructional tool, or like what's the impetus, perhaps, when you were writing it? Was it about the journey? Was it about the education? How do you sort of distinguish between those two things, or the purpose, perhaps, of behind the novel? Is it you know, memoirs are a little tricky, I think, in that they can be used sort of as stories, but they can also be used as teaching devices. So do you see as sort of a project of teaching, a project of recollecting, or how do you sort of see the work?
I see it as the unraveling of a mystery. And I felt compelled to write it, not specifically as an educational tool, but not as a story per se, as much as, and I guess it was more as a story in the sense of, I felt compelled to write about the unraveling of a mystery, and I was writing it almost concurrently, you know, with how it was happening. Partly because that's what I do. I mean, I write, but also because I could tell that, you know, I get this email from someone I've never heard of before, and who is clearly my nephew. And I go down into the basement, and I describe this in the book. I go down to the basement to get some photos for him. And while looking for photos for him, I find all these other documents that point me towards things I didn't even know existed, or didn't have a way of understanding what they were. And, you know, I sat in the basement for a good long while, and it's not a very comfortable basement. And I'm sitting there going, what is all this stuff? And, you know, it's, you know, this time where you get lightheaded and you're kind of just like, oh my God, what is all this? And, you know, my world is about to change. And so I immediately knew that this was something I was going to be writing about. Because I knew I was going to be learning things. So yes, it's educational and it's a story, but it was more about sort of unraveling a mystery that I knew at the heart was crucial to who I am as a human being. And as I started to delve into it more, realizing it's, you know, it's a story that I think not my story is crucial to everyone else, but the story is crucial to understanding a lot about the world around us.
Yeah, I definitely think so. So as we sort of wrap it up, where can people find the book and keep track of you and what's going on next?
I have a website called www.michaelmissing.com, where I blog occasionally and certainly have links to the book. The book is available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com as an ebook, as a paperback, as a hardcover, as of June 1st.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on and speaking to me. I really appreciate your time, and I wish you good luck with the book.
Thanks so much.